Ali Vaez is the director of the crisis group's Iran project, and he joins me now from Washington. Good to have you on the program with us. There was optimism coming out of this first day of talks. Are you hopeful for progress in this round, and how critical are these talks after a 5-month pause?
Look, it's hard to be hopeful because although this is a relatively good start to the new round of negotiations, but the reality is that diplomatic momentum has been lost after a 5-month long pause, and the two sides are far apart on key issues. We know that the Iranian new nuclear negotiating team is going to drive a much harder bargain. What we don't know is whether they also have the requisite flexibility to meet the US halfway and find a mutually acceptable formula. And I think this first round is really just as a throat clearing exercise, mostly for both sides, rather than getting deep into the substance of negotiations.
Yeah, Iran won't meet directly with the Americans. For example, how challenging does that make it then to make any headway in these talks?
Unfortunately, these kind of proximity talks would create a lot of space for misunderstandings. And it would have been much smoother, obviously, if Iran and the US were sitting at the same table. In addition to the fact that Iran rejects direct negotiations with the US, this time around, the new Iranian nuclear negotiating team does not speak English. So talks would have to go through consecutive translation as well. And that adds to the length and complexity of these negotiations, and again, creates more space for misunderstandings.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of complications involved. President Biden says he is willing to lift U.S. sanctions on Iran if Iran reverses the breaches to the deal, but Iran says it wants the U.S. to make the first move. Do you see either country budging in this at all?
I don't particularly think that the sequencing question is too problematic. The US is willing to do the heavy lifting of sanctions early on and front load basically sanctions relief. But I think the difference comes when the Iranians expect 2 to 3 months, if not more, time for them to verify the effectiveness of sanctions relief before they take any actions. And it's really hard to, almost impossible to imagine that while Iran is growing its nuclear program, the US would lift its sanctions and then sit just on its hand until Iran decides one day to go back into compliance. So there needs to be a better sequencing, although the US is willing to front load sanctions relief. But this is not the main issue. The main issue in the talks is really the question of the scope of sanctions relief and also guarantees that the Iranians are asking that not just this administration, but the next US administration would not once again renege on the nuclear deal. And that's really difficult to deliver.
And in its current state, is the JCPOA useful at all, you think?
Look, it is still the least costly option for both sides. All the alternatives to it, which basically range from unattractive to ugly, are costlier for both parties, not just Iran, which would suffer from more sanctions and isolation, but also the rapid growth of Iran's nuclear program would create a lot of concern in the international community and could result in a military confrontation between Israel, the U.S., and Iran. But at this stage, I think it's hard to imagine that the deal in limbo could really survive beyond next spring unless there is some sort of a diplomatic breakthrough.
All right, we'll leave it there for now. Ali Vaez joining us from Washington. Thank you.